Okay.
It's about a minute in. Oh, wait, we're live. Who clicked go live?
I didn't click it.
Oh, is that what you wanted me to do?
All right. Hold on. Let me go do the intro.
Hello, everybody.
Well,
Good
hello.
morning, Brian.
Good morning, John. Loving the hair today, John. We're fashion state.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting start. You know, if anyone had any doubt about this being a new medium, I think that was confirmed by, the kind of scotch tape and baling wire nature of our beginning. It's kind of like the early days of the movie industry where people had to figure out, well, what is lighting, or where do we put the camera to make people look good or make them look not so good? So
we're becoming AV experts.
Yeah, exactly. So we're still in the process of figuring it out, which is fun.
Yeah, what's also fun is Gregarious, our producer, was sharing backstage that, John, just to give you a heads up before I forget, we're going to be shifting from StreamYard to another platform. So to be continued on a conversation so that we know what we're doing. But with that said, welcome everybody. Welcome to Intersections. We'll do the formal introduction. Our first guest is here. So thank you so much. This community is you. We do this every week where we learn, we unlearn together. We have fantastic guests who end up inspiring us, and there is not enough time in the day to ask every question that we want. So I think we've officially re-invited every guest we've ever had to continue the conversation. So with that said, welcome to Intersections, the weekly conversational jam session that dives deep into the intersections of technology, innovation, culture, and ideas. Every Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Pacific, we bring diverse personalities and worldviews together in service of greater understanding and unlearning. My co-host and co-founder and also fashion icon John Kao, whom the Economist has called Mr. Creativity and a serial innovator, is with us today, and I'm proud to be his partner here in this show. He is my brother from another mother, and I learned from him as well. If you tuned in last week, we had a one-on-one conversation because one of our guests couldn't make it at the last minute, and so we interviewed each other. It turned out to be a fascinating conversation, one that I plan on revisiting from an article standpoint. He's a thought leader, entrepreneur, and advisor. He is he's just an icon in the world of innovation, and literally the world of innovation. He taught at Harvard Business School. He served as visiting faculty at MIT Media Lab in Stanford. He's also a Tony-nominated producer of film and stage. He wrote the best-selling book, Jamming: The Art and Discipline of Business Creativity. He's also an incredible musician. In fact, the idea of jazz and jamming was inspired by him. This is a man who has 3 grand pianos in his living room, and you'll see that when we have our live salons. John, welcome to Intersections.
Thank you, Brian. Well, everybody should have 3 grand pianos in their living room, in my humble opinion. I've never been called an icon before. A couple of weeks ago, somebody called me a innovation folk hero, which I guess was a compliment. But I am so happy to be your partner in this enterprise. And let me just say that you're my innovation twin, because having now done this for almost a year, it's clear that the way we think about things and our networks and our conceptual frameworks are highly complementary. And in an era where innovation is, in a sense, up for grabs because it's the most talked about and the least understood item in the management lexicon, it's very important that we're working together to figure this stuff out. So Brian's been involved in the digital domain before digital was really recognized as a thing, and has made important conceptual bridges between digital and the field of innovation, digital and social media, digital and marketing. And he's been around. I mean, I'm always in awe of his network and the breadth of his relationship, his social capital, and his relationship framework. He's a celebrated best-selling author. He's an in-demand speaker. He's a thought leader who's continuously and generously shared his knowledge with all of us. And he even has a day job, which is global evangelist for innovation at Salesforce. So here we are.
Here we are. Thank you for that, John. And our first guest is with us. So before we bring on Tim, I do want to invite you, our guests, our viewers, to share where you're tuning in from, to share your thoughts, your observations in real time. We get to them, we feature them on screen. You're part of this show just as much as John, myself, and our guests. So this is a community, the Intersections community. We jam live together. So with that, John, I'll turn it over to you to welcome our first guest.
Excellent. Well, I couldn't be more excited to introduce Tim Kobe, who is the founder and leader of a design firm called 8 Inc. that has a client list and a project list that really boggles the mind. Tim is perhaps best known for being the original design force behind the Apple stores, but has done so many things in the design field that we could probably spend the rest of the hour just enumerating them. And the interesting thing to me, as someone who's been implicated in the design field, so to speak, for quite some time, is that over 30 years, he's established himself as a strong voice for thought leadership in the design field, a voice for the globalization of design, and a voice for, in a sense, morphing design from being the externalities to being very much at the core of what organizations need to do. So, Tim, it's a pleasure to meet you and to welcome you to the show.
Welcome, Tim. Welcome.
Thank you, guys.
So,
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I wish we had like 3 hours, but I'll just jump in with a couple of questions. You know, we've just gone through this pandemic, and obviously there's been more digital. There's been a shift in terms of human interaction and so on. How has that affected your thinking about design and what some of the frontier areas might be? You know, what do you make of what we've gone through over the last year and a half?
Well, I guess when we think about the pandemic and the kinds of impacts that other pandemics have had, I always look at it as from a perspective of, you know, what did we learn and how could we improve on how we handle, how we manage it. I don't know, somebody said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think, you know, what this is there's an opportunity to look at, you know, the kinds of issues that are going to ultimately serve for better human outcomes as we come out of this pandemic. And I think, you know, whether it's been the plague or other type of things that have happened historically, we've always tended to use the stress that was created on the system to reevaluate and to look at new ways of solving the problems that led us down that path. And I think we can clearly see that there's still a natural disconnect. I mean, this is something that really doesn't have any border, and as a result, it's one of the probably prime examples of a demand of having us all sort of look after one another, but look at it from a broader perspective than maybe our local or national boundaries.
Right. It's been a global crisis, and I imagine it encourages thinking about design from a global perspective as well. And you are operating out of Singapore, which I'm curious about for a number of reasons. I did a lot of advisory work for the government of Singapore when they were still in the early days of figuring out creative industries and design and their media strategy and so on. This would be going back to the 80s. In fact, and I'm curious as to why you chose Singapore, but also how the globality of design kind of affects your thinking about priorities and what's important to you.
Yeah, I guess they're probably connected. I guess as a designer, you tend to want to work on things that have the most has the most positive impact for the most people. And having founded our office in the Bay Area, grown up in California, really a strong believer in the gestalt of the culture that's there. I think my mother was probably one of the first hippies in Haight-Ashbury, but coming out of that background, really I found a lot of rich experience that I think could be applied in other locations. And if you look at Singapore, it happens to be an interesting sort of outlier to most of Southeast Asia in terms of the way it's governed and structured. But what's the most interesting, I suppose, is that out of the 7+ billion people that we have on the planet, 5.5 billion are within an 8-hour flight of Singapore, and the majority of them are under 30. So if you look at where the economy and where the most impact could be felt, that seems like a good central location to work from. And so for me, it was also, I went there 10 years ago and started growing our Asia business. Now probably half of our studios are in Asia. But I went there initially. It was a relatively young market. It's progressed rapidly in terms of trying to really emulate the other parts of the world where innovation and entrepreneurism has helped grow the economy. But I think Singapore. We were looking at a base for Asia to grow the business, and the government there reached out and basically made us an offer we couldn't refuse, and so there I went.
So that's an interesting aspect of Singapore, which is that the government itself is a source of demand for design as a public good, which is, I think, rather unique compared to most other places. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about the client centered nature of most design firms versus the purpose-driven nature of what design has to offer, right? So my sense is most design firms are still in the kind of client model of somebody comes in with a problem and it's interesting, you work on it, and if it's got societal benefit, that's great, and you try to get those things to line up. But I wonder why more design firms that have achieved a certain level of success aren't actually using their design skills in a sense to be their own client, or to select clients who have a wicked problem or a grand challenge or a sustainable development goal, and work on those. And A, do you think that's reasonable? And B, do you see that happening more, or are there still some structural obstacles to that kind of behavior?
Well, I think obviously it's a growing economy. So if you look at the broad kind of macro view of what's possible there, there is a lot of competition, a lot of learning that's going on. So on one hand, it's a very dynamic type of environment, and when I first was looking at different locations, Singapore stood out primarily to me because the majority of things that you encounter there have been considered, and it struck me as a place that was unique in the standpoint that things just didn't happen. There was typically a fair amount of consideration before a decision was made, and then it was deployed. And so I actually wrote a piece about Lee Kuan Yew, who's the nation's founder, and started to discuss him. Having worked with Steve Jobs for many years, I was looking at Lee Kuan Yew from the perspective of him being a designer of a country as opposed to a politician. Everybody talks about him as a politician, obviously, and that's his core. But many of the things that he brought to the country in terms of his approach to looking at problems, his approach to identifying solutions that he had hoped would serve the most good in the nation. A lot of those things were design practices from my perspective. And so I felt like there was a foundational aspect to their country that really stemmed from the founding of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could argue that politicians or political leaders in general have a design responsibility that too often is just latent or ignored because of ignorance or lack of time or whatever. And they're focusing on incrementalism and maybe even preserving the status quo. So in the interest of time, I just have one last question, which is you're obviously intimately familiar with the whole design thinking movement where the principles of design are being used to craft corporate strategy and innovation processes and things that really no longer have to do with designing products, services, or experiences, but really designing strategies. And I see that as kind of a, an effort to take design's value proposition and, put it into a different place in the organizational framework. And I'm wondering what you think about design thinking, just from a 10,000 foot perspective. And, does it have legs? And do you see it kind of prospering, or do you have a different point of view about it?
Well, I think it's probably misunderstood. Design thinking is what we were taught, in school as the front end of a process. And so when we think about design thinking as a term, I think in many places people believe that if you go through that initial process that design thinking tends to focus on, that when you finish that, you're done. And in fact, it's design doing is the hard part. And I think that we look at something called the value creation engine, and it's not so much a formulaic type of structure, but what we do is we try to look at what are the primary human outcomes you're looking at in any design problem, and from that you then form the strategy to deliver those outcomes. And from that, you then employ the tactics to deliver on the strategy to deliver the outcomes. So in many consulting relationships, we work on that strategic part. We call it an experience master plan. What is the experience that people are going to have with what it is you're designing? But ultimately, majority of companies will come at a solution from a tactic standpoint first. Mm-hmm. And we always see that as sort of the end result of it. But I think you need to have an end-to-end way of thinking about it. And design thinking as a term and certainly as a buzzword these days has elevated itself. But people I think misunderstand it. They don't see it as just the beginning. They see it as that's what design is.
It's a process of auto elevation, I guess.
I think so.
Well, I'm going to now defer to my colleague Brian and throw over to you, Brian, because I know you're hankering to get in there.
Oh, I'm a big design geek, and I love experience design, experience architecture, brand experience. And there's this quote on your site from Marshall McLuhan that is, everybody experiences far more than he understands, yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about design thinking or design or innovation, we get caught up in this understanding of the world as we see it and the world as we know it. When in fact, the difference between understanding and experience is one of logic versus emotion. And emotion is incredibly illogical. And we tend to, the word experience is just that. It's an emotional reaction to something. And when you design for that emotional reaction, it's very different than just trying to design for the functional, logistical, tactical outcomes. And when you design for emotional outcomes, it's much more powerful and meaningful and relevant. And Tim, I'm a big fan of your work. I was introduced to it in the early days for what you did with Apple and Steve Jobs. And now it seems that everybody's trying to emulate your design techniques in what we're seeing in everything from retail to experiential commerce. And the one thing that I found most fascinating was that you did design for that emotional experience and how that experience would align with the Apple brand as Steve was trying to design it then. So I wanted to just give that whole prelude to the question that I'm going to ask, which is, now we live in a world where a significant percentage of people have learned digital first behaviors, whether that's shopping, working from home, learning from home. And now we have to reimagine what that future of physical and hybrid design is going to look like. So in your opinion, how has this changed the trajectory for what experience design could or should look like moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. We could probably talk about this for a few hours. The interesting thing I think about the Apple program and many other programs we've been involved in is that when you talk about experience at a pretty high level, what you're fundamentally doing is looking at the relationship between people, two different groups of people, one being that the company and the products and services they want to deliver, and the people that they want to connect with. And so the design, the experience design that you focus on is really, it's communicating the values of what you stand for. And that's what we did with Apple. But you're communicating the values of the company, and you're doing it in a way that it can be felt. And that's a little different than it being sort of analytically processed. And as you pointed out, it does have an emphasis on an emotional connection that you're looking to build with people. But we also try to take really two levers into the conversation. One is the emotional part. How do we connect on a behavioral level, the things that drive behavior, the way that our brain works, and also how do we differentiate from others? So very often in business, the mistake is to emulate one another, and that's one of the greatest things that Apple's competitors did for Apple was to emulate them, or to try to emulate them. The best way to make someone else to make someone else the leader is for you to become the follower. And so that has been something that we've been preaching for a long time, but looking at differentiation as a core element of the toolkit that you have to create value. And when we think about now the sort of this, years ago they were talking about this polarity between physical space and virtual space, and we see it as really one thing today. You're very seldom in a physical space without a virtual space device enabling you. And so we see these two things coming together, and having now been the basis for many of our projects in the last few years, where the virtual and physical space are basically one. And so the attributes of approaching the design to communicate its values and to communicate the elements that resonate with people naturally based on human behavior. The mobile devices, the technology that we have, as well as the physical space, and I would say also the human behavior element, which is another component of this. Those are the core experience realms that we can look at and say, all right, how can we improve a condition? How can we make your relationship between your company and the people you want to connect with stronger and more beneficial for each other?
I think that is key in that when we think about our investment in space, whether that's retail or whether that's a museum or whether that's a theme park, is that we forget the human being on the other side of that experience, and we also forget that human being on the other side of the experience isn't us, and oftentimes, and to design for someone at an emotional level is to know them and to love them, and I think it's a practice that's sort of out of traditional C-suites, but now in a world where you have the metaverse that's emerging, you have augmented reality that's starting to take shape. Space itself isn't just a function of design, or the expression of a designer based on whatever trend they seem to be enamored with at that moment.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on the differences in that emotional type of design, and what executives who are watching this episode need to think differently about as they work with partners or work with you as they reimagine space in the future.
Well, I think it's easy to get caught up with the internal aspects of your company, whether it's from line managers to C-suite. But I think it's easy to get caught up in whatever your KPIs are, and letting those KPIs drive ultimately the things that you offer, the things that you create. But what I think is probably the most interesting is we tend to work a lot with C-level people, primarily because most of the different experience realms, the different work streams that I was just talking about, those things typically come together at the top of an organization. And most organizations are structured in silos, where they'll take elements that influence the experience and parse them out into separate verticals in an organization. And so I think, to me, experience is a lateral thing. It's something that you experience across many different types of touch points. And the consistency of expression of the values you have as a company, as well as the value proposition you have, is essential to live in each of those areas.
Yeah, it's so well said. Yeah, our next guest is here, but I have to ask one last question. Is sort of inspired here by Arthur's point.
Okay.
We famously heard, I think John and I, we talked about this last week, that the CEO of a financial institution drew that line in the sand that said everybody has to come back to the office in September or else. But I think that there's an opportunity to reimagine work, reimagine schools, now that we've got to experience this hybrid world. Tim, what should executives think about now in the future of work that aligns with what you just said in terms of spatial design? How should executives think differently about their employees, and maybe even universities or schools should think differently about what in-person learning looks like?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the pandemic has pointed out fundamental flaws in the way we think about designing cities. I think that our transportation networks, the idea that we waste so much time in the process of getting from one point to another in order to do a particular task, it's very much an industrial era kind of model. And I think what we need to do is this notion of a 12-minute city where you're able to satisfy the things that you need, whether that be living, working, or playing, within a reasonably close proximity to where you are, and be able to bring diverse teams, bring people from different locations, just as we are today on Zoom. But that's going to become more and more a part of the equation. And the long commutes, I mean, most young people that we talk to, most people in our studios, they don't want to waste that much of their life sitting in some sort of commute mode, whether it be automated or not. It's just they see it as basically a waste of time. So if our cities are going to improve things, I think that it has to go back to what are going to be things that strengthen the humanity of our interactions, and what are the things that are going to be responsive to certainly our environmental pressures and sustainability. But these things, I think, have a fundamental impact on the way our urban environment has been created. We've isolated things into these sectors in much the way we would have a factory, but we've traded the factory floor for the cubicle floor, and I don't think that that's quite what people are looking for today. And this has just been a huge impetus to look at that change.
I gotta remember that quote from factory floor to cubicle floor. Well said, Tim. It's an absolute pleasure. I think we're also exploring some conversations behind the scenes on some potential collaboration and bringing to light and extending this conversation around experience design. So, Tim, absolute pleasure and honor to have you on our show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Wow, you know, he had me thinking too about this. IKEA has an innovation lab, and it's called Space 10, and its the sole purpose is to not just think about the future of furniture, but to think about the future of living, and then how furniture plays a role in that. And one of the things, this was pre-pandemic, I read a report that said that they'd expect not only younger people moving to city centers, but city centers becoming so overcrowded as a result that they were going to have to reimagine living spaces. And so like multifamily living units were going to become a thing. And how would they design furniture for that type of living? So it's a fascinating conversation.
Like the Salesforce Tower, right?
Well, yes, indeed.
Repurpose that for, 20-something Gen Z residences.
In fact, our whole Salesforce organization, as we now balance work from anywhere world, that we're also reimagining our own spaces so that they reflect what a future workplace can look like. So it's very, very exciting to be part of it. And with that said, our next guest is backstage, so I'll go ahead and give him a formal introduction. So this is someone whose work that I've actually followed for quite a bit of time. His name is Jeff Desjardins. Had a fumble on that one, but it's one of those lovely last names that you have to think about as you say it. Jeff is he's the editor-in-chief of Visual Capitalist, and this is a site that, like Information is Beautiful, has a way of just communicating information in ways that connect with you much more instantly. I talked about this in my last book, X, which was about experience design, where if you look at a parking sign as a vehicle to communicate information, i.e., can I park here? Would you design a parking sign the same way today if you started from scratch? And the answer is absolutely not. It would be much more visuals reflective of, say, like a modern UI for a mobile screen. But I have Jeff's new book, Signals, here, which you could see just how gorgeous this is. In fact, for those who've read X, this reminds me a lot of X. I tried to use when I was designing that book, mobile UX and UI as a form of bringing the pages to life on paper in the way that you would on a screen. And I jokingly but also lovingly referred to it as a analog app. And I get that same vibes here with Jeff's new book, Signals. So let's bring Jeff on. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, where are you tuning in from?
Vancouver, BC.
Oh man, I joked that if the election had gone another way, I was going to move to Vancouver, and I think everybody was saying no, don't come. But we want to keep it as is and peaceful and it's beautiful without all this invasion of new people coming in. But Jeff, it's an absolute pleasure. Big fan of your work. Why don't we kick off with sharing sort of like the story behind Visual Catalyst, and we'll get into your book as well, but it's all interrelated anyway. But the inspiration behind it and how fast you grew and the reason why how fast you grew. I think you hit like 73 million visits or something like that. It's an incredible story. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so Visual Capitalist, our mission and vision really revolves around making the world's data more accessible and making it so that everybody can understand data. As you guys know, data is multiplying at a rate that we've never seen before in human history. And humans have not been able to keep pace and being able to process that data in terms of like mental capacity, right? When you think about human evolution, people in caves and so on, and building culture and throughout history, nothing has prepared us to be able to compute massive amounts of data in our brains that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And that rate of data is just increasing, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take all of that information, to synthesize it, to find the things that are most useful, and to be fair about how we fair and neutral about how we portray that information using the most reputable sources possible. And then as we do that, we visualize it so that people can look at it and instantly, get a sense of what's going on in the world. And so we cover a variety of sectors from technology to everything to, green energy or financial markets and so on. So it's a wide range of stuff. So for curious people that want to learn more about the world, it's really, that's what it's all about. And in terms of the growth, the catalyst for that, especially in the most recent year, was definitely COVID, in that you had so many people at home, and you also had, especially with data visualization, it came to the forefront as everybody needed to understand, how to flatten the curve, how to understand these different types of charts that were coming out, explaining the different case counts and death tolls and things like that from the pandemic. So, we've been very fortunate in that we've benefited from that, and that our style of storytelling and data visualization has, it's entered the global stage. In that sense, it's the right time for it.
I used two key words there, which was visualization and storytelling. And as you said, we live in this world where there's almost, well, not almost, there's too much data, and those data sources are only going to continue to multiply. And it's a good thing for those who know how to capture that information, to communicate it in a way that tells a story that also drives new behaviors, inspires new outcomes. And data can uniquely tell that story in ways that I don't think many people are, what's the best way, practiced to retell, because we do have new stories. In our conversation with Tim earlier, there's an entirely new story to be told about the future of space and design for a hybrid world. But if we're not connecting the dots between those insights and these new storylines, it's going to be difficult to inspire that change and to accelerate that needed change to be successful in this new future. So, like a long-winded version of getting down to what are the skill sets and the best practices that you see at Visual Capitalists to bring this to life, so that other organizations can humanize and visualize this data, not into just stories, but stories that drive new change?
Yeah, so this is a really complex question. I think there's a lot of stuff we can go into here. I think one of the things that I find is something that people don't expect to be a central part of this is that humans are, as storytellers and as as you've seen through media and the different stories that enter our everyday lives, we infuse everything with our biases. And so from this perspective, I think also because of social media and because a bunch of different other changes that have happened in the digital realm, what we're seeing is that people are also becoming more skeptical of information as it's coming by them. People are worried that it's, the fake news, so to speak, or that information that they're seeing isn't real or legit. And so as we're doing data visualization and as we're framing issues and as we're telling these stories, one thing that we think is really important is how we go about doing that, and to do it carefully and to do it in a neutral way, and to do it in a way that best sets up the insights that someone is about to discover from the information, rather than trying to take whatever is the most juicy piece of information necessarily, which other media might do, because that is sometimes something that's going to it's going to make people look at this thing and say, oh, this isn't real, or oh, I don't believe that this is valid information, and so on. So this whole area, so we look at things from a few angles here. One is the source of the information needs to be totally unimpeachable. So a lot of the information that we use, we're trying to pull from sources like the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations or different institutions. Sometimes we're pulling them from companies that we think are very reputable. So for example, if you're using something from McKinsey or something like that, where they've dove into the research in depth, or someone like the big accounting firms like PwC and those groups usually have really good information as well. So we're trying to make sure that information is coming from the most reputable place to start with, and that, you know, just based on that, more people are open to absorbing that information, right? Because if you're pulling information from some sort of right or left-leaning think tank, or if you're pulling information from a source that is not deemed to be reputable, you're already in trouble. Then the second thing is we think a lot about how we are positioning and framing that information. So if you're taking a lot of the titles you'll see on our website and in places you'll see are very boring on purpose. The 50 most innovative companies in the world, as you guys showed earlier, or this is breaking down the world's $90 trillion economy. Like the titles that we use say what we're trying to show, but they don't go and try and make things juicier than they are, or try and pull out the fact that's going to get people upset, or to create all of that fake engagement that we see around. And this helps buy credibility with the user that's looking at the visualization. We think the visualizations are beautiful enough by themselves that they alone can capture people's attention. So we don't need to spice it up anymore with fancy titles or anything like that. We're trying to make it so that you look at this and you say, yes, I see the source, I see the visualization, this is real information, it's helping me absorb it, I'm learning something. And now I can go about my day with that, additional, factoid that I picked up, or what have you.
Man, that's so powerful, and there's so much to pull out from that. John, I'm going to throw it to you. I just have to ask one last question though, because as John knows, this is a super hot point for me. You know, I don't know at what point in history that facts became subjectable, or that truth became open to interpretation. But reputable sources, as you and I define them, are certainly not the way that they are being defined these days. So, for example, if you were to do a visualization of the resurgence of COVID and the Delta variant, that would lead to absolute division, even though you would use the most reputable source. So curious to see how you're seeing that trend. And then, John, please take over. How is this trending out? Because this can't continue on its path. How can visualization bring people together, I guess?
Yeah, and that's the part that I love most about what we do, which is that we sometimes tell stories that I think are going to be divisive, and that I worry is going to have that type of divide that you're talking about. And of course, sometimes they do. But there's other times where we put out something, and I remember one time, a long time ago, we put out basically a map and the story around the Keystone XL pipeline that was going. This is 5 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever. It was a long time ago. But when we put it out, there's people on both sides of the argument that were using our visualization as a reference point. So you had the pro-business people and you had the green people, both using it and saying, hey, well, this fact, blah, 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 arguing this way or that way. But it was really cool to see those two different groups who normally would, in today's environment, be exposed to much different information on both sides of their spectrum and where they're getting their data from. They both kind of looked at this thing and they both thought it was fair. And they both looked at it. And because the data was there, the sources were there, and it's hard to disagree with it when it's right in front of your face, outlined in that way. And while you're also paying homage to some of the things that they find as key issues, right? It helps open a lot of minds when you're able to do that. And I'm not saying that we do that successfully every single time, but I think that a good visualization that is data driven by reputable sources, I think if you do it in the right way, and you are able to at least open some people's minds to the other side of the aisle, or what might be possible, or what maybe they haven't yet thought about, or maybe even just instilling that maybe you don't know everything about the world, right? We're all, there's so many people out there that have this extreme amount of confidence that they know everything. And I think the smart people are those that know that they know nothing. And that's the way that we approach this from, right? Which is like, we don't know a lot, but here are the facts that we've found from very reputable sources. And hopefully this will inform you to have a better opinion, or a more informed opinion.
Oh man, yes. I guess, John, we could talk about that for hours, just in using storytelling Yeah, to bring people
Yeah.
together versus divide us. So over to you, John.
So this is a very timely conversation. I've been corresponding recently with my former colleague, Howard Gardner, who, as you know, pioneered the notion of multiple intelligences and kind of championed visual intelligence as something that ought to be on the dais along with, SAT and analytical kinds of intelligence. So, obviously hats off to you for paying off on that insight. I had a couple of questions. One is, do you do any visual design and information architecture that is not so much data driven as representing procedural knowledge? So, for instance, you have the SDGs and there are all of these future pathways in terms of what you have to do about them. Or, there's a modal innovation. I traffic a lot in innovation as a subject matter. And, there's a lot of debate about what constitutes a modal innovation system, right? Or representing various forms of representative government. I mean, I'm just making these up as we go along. To what extent is your model strictly based on representation of data versus also accommodating procedural knowledge? Because your skill set is obviously extremely valuable for the latter.
Yeah, 100%. So I think the type of thing that we try to avoid visualizing is when something is so qualitative that you neither have that procedural aspect to it or the data-driven aspect to it, where it's just kind of fluffy images and illustrations and text beside them, right? Which is kind of like some of the early infographics, if you think of it that way, right? That's the stuff that we try to avoid. But procedural, I definitely think is something that can be done because, and in terms of the work that we do, having this, being able to clearly show steps and saying, here's step one, here's what happens there, and step two, and so on. I mean, that's a really powerful way of telling a story, and that's also a really, like, people can understand that, right? It's just the same thing as when you're from the media side of things, when you write an article that's like, these are the 5 types of innovation or something like that, right? It's the reader goes into it knowing, okay, there's 5 types that was in the title. Now I'm going to go and learn about these 5 types. You are already able to come into it with that framing in mind, and you already know what you're getting out of it. And to me, procedural does that same thing. It organizes thoughts in a way that I find really useful. And if you're doing it right, you can use data to back up each of those steps, right? So you say in your first step, as you say, like, here's how we reach certain SDGs or something like that, right? Well, the first step or the first bit of information might be something like, okay, here's where we're at today on this particular goal, right? And the situation is not as good as we would like it to be. Here's the data backing it up, and then here's the potential problems it's going to cause down the road. And there, maybe you're using forecasts from those reputable sources saying, well, if we don't solve X by this date, then this is what's projected to happen. And then maybe on the next part, you're saying, okay, what are the steps that we can reverse this issue? Or what are the steps, how can we tackle this issue? And then you go into, the first thing we should do is, given the data that we just saw, is we should, take this step. So I think it is a really powerful way of storytelling.
Great. Well, we have a lot of things that we could be talking about after the show, for sure. So another question is, you've published this book, which I just ordered on it, and I'm looking forward to reading. Books are obviously a slice of life, and data is a flow. And so, to what extent are you interested in, or is it part of your forthcoming model to basically be able to represent some of these infographics or pieces of knowledge architecture, information architecture as dynamic maps, almost like dashboards that are constantly refreshed, because things are moving so rapidly. You would think that would be valuable. And there are companies. I don't know if you are familiar with Signal in San Francisco, but it's one of a number of companies that are scraping data from the internet on an ongoing basis and then figuring out a nice way of representing it so you can find out how your brand is doing in the world or related matters, and then you have a nice kind of visualization of that. What are your thoughts about, kind of slice of life versus dynamic?
So in the book, we chose the signals that are in the book based on not only them being really important in the future, but one of our criteria was that in the past, you can see this trend developing over time, right? So if you look at something like global aging, for example, that's one of the very first signals in the book. It's something that has been happening since, there's a clear trend from the 1970s all the way to, so it's been happening for 50 years already based on UN data, and it's going to happen for another 100 years probably, right? And so when you look at something like that, it's a very long-term and important trend, and so in that sense, it's not. It can be portrayed in that static way, I believe, because it's been happening for 50 years already, and it's going to keep on happening. It's something like that is not driven by technology as much, although obviously it plays a role. So if there's some sort of game-changing innovation that's going to allow people to live 30 years longer, then that trend is basically going to stay intact in the exact same way. And if we have that innovation happen, then obviously we have a lot more to talk about at that point in time. But yeah, some of the other trends, though, you're right. They are happening faster, and they are much more dynamic. And this is, of course, is just the nature of today's world and where we are on the technological spectrum. So yeah, I think portraying these things in a dynamic way can be really powerful. And what we've done with each of the signals in the book is we've selected one data set that we call the signal, and then all the other information is basically backing it up, saying, okay, well, we said that this was our signal, but how do we prove it? Here's all of the different data sets that help prove it out and flesh it out so that you see the context around it. But yeah, the ones that are just the signals themselves, like the actual most important pieces for each topic, I believe those can definitely be dynamic, right? Because we've chosen that sort of based on this criteria, anyways, that it's simple and easy to understand. We could have all of them on some sort of dashboard and constantly evolving as data is updated.
I mean, not to play a business advisor or anything, but it seems to me there's a whole derivative business on top of what you're doing, which is, for instance, selecting the relevant signals that propel an organization into a different scenario world, right? So if the data from the scenario work is about creating an early warning system for when things are tipping in one direction or another, and you slice that data-driven representation in a way that someone could actually just have it on their desktop as a widget, like if they're in the energy business or something like that and they're tracking stuff. So it's interesting, and it sounds like you're thinking about that. So it'll be interesting to follow your progress. So one more from me is how do you go about selecting the projects that you do? I mean, what you must have some kind of an internal authoring process, or I don't know. And tell us a little bit more about what's backstage in terms of your team. I mean, I imagine you've got a lot of designers and so forth and so on. But I mean, do you have meetings? Do you pitch ideas? Is it like a story room in a TV show? I mean, how do you do it?
Yeah, if you think about it like any other type of media organization, like a Forbes or something like that, you have all these people, these editors, and also we have writers in the background that are constantly looking for the next story, or when companies or organizations release really killer data sets, obviously that's a big catalyst for us as well. So we're looking at the news cycle, what's happening there. We're looking at what data is being released this week that could help drive a story. We're looking at how trends are evolving and how people are talking about those things, and when something is going to crystallize and become suddenly something that's really important and that everybody's talking about. And so, yeah, we have a weekly meeting from that side, but also at the same time, I mean, people are constantly pitching ideas and throwing them out there. And a lot of the time we're even taking things that people have already created, whether it's a article or a visualization, and we're saying, hey, there's something here. This is really compelling. What if we took this and we found the right data behind it to show it in a very different, but also very compelling way? So it's a little bit of that, I guess that sort of creative destruction and remaking something from where it came from as well. So there's a little bit of everything there. But ultimately, we release about 7 to 10 things per week. And so we do have to have a good flow of ideas coming in for sure.
And do people present you with ideas from the outside, or are your projects? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No. And they're all over the place. I mean, we get some of the craziest ideas and some of the best ideas from those sources, and sometimes the crazy ideas are the best ideas. But no, it's quite a we get quite a mix from people just emailing us or pinging us on social, and yeah, a lot of times people will think of it as today you showed GDP per capita globally, but what if you showed GDP per capita versus debt globally, or something like debt per capita globally, or something. So a lot of times people will come up with an idea that is a spin-off of something that we've already done.
Yeah, a derivative, like correlating it with something else, like movie theater ticket sales or something of that kind.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, my hat's off to you. I think this is really great what you're doing, and I as I said, I've got a couple of ideas for you, so we'll take those offline.
Sounds great.
Brian, back to you, and here we have another great show.
Oh, amazing! And it's been wonderful, Jeff, to hear your viewpoints, your experiences. I have to, my hat that I'm not wearing is off to you, in that someone who has experimented with storytelling in all of its forms. You have there's a magical quality into how you present that information. So the word infographic doesn't even come into it.
It doesn't dignify it enough.
Yeah, it doesn't dignify it in any way, shape, or form. So, Jeff, good luck with the book Signals. John will attest that our guests are so incredible that his library is expanding. With every new guest we have.
Occupational necessity now.
To be continued. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks,
Great
guys.
to see you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Another amazing show in the book.
Design bath today.
I know, Tim. That was very cool as well. I'm going to stall here while I put in the comments here links to our guests. I meant to do that here earlier. One more URL to come, and voila. Well, John, as always, it's a pleasure to see you.
Indeed.
And loving the hair. Keep that fashion going. I'm going to have to take some cues from you. And I will see you next Thursday. We'll see you next Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Thank you for being part of the Intersections experience. Please do share your thoughts. Please do invite other people to watch the show as well. This is a community that enriches based on participation. And so thank you. Hey, John, why don't you virtually take us out for the week?